Hello again from Jenkins Ferry. I'm taking you on a little road trip for just a few minutes here. We're actually about 3 miles south of the battlefield right now. We're in the town of Leola, and this is the one of the main highways. I forget which highway this is here, but we're about to cross onto what was called Grant County Road number 1. This is Grant County Road number 1, and what is very cool about this, and I'll show you here in just a second, this is actually going to take us down to two of the most unique sites related to the Battle of Jenkins Ferry. And to the left here, that's the local timber company. It's a massive operation out there. And we're going to continue around here. I'm about to show you something very, very cool right here. The blacktop is actually going to end here, and it turns into a gravel road. And what is so cool about this right here is Grant County Road number 1 is actually the original military road. So the road that we're on right now, the road you're seeing, is the original military road that was used by the Union and Confederate troops in April of 1864. So on the afternoon of April 29th, 1864, the Federal troops came up from the south. That's the south directly in front of us, and they would be moving in a northerly direction up this road. And you know, we've talked about this several times. We've talked about how muddy it was, how much rain it was. So this was not gravel. This was just dirt out here, and it was very, it was horrible to get through out here. In places, this road was knee deep mud. There would be wagons that would break down and bog down. But this was the original road that the Federal Army moved up on the afternoon of April 29th, 1864. Now, several hours after the Federals moved up this road, then the Confederates would work their way up this very same road. This is almost like a living history type thing to me, because you're actually driving on history. This is not some obscure thing that's been placed later on down through the years. This is the original military road that these armies traveled up on. So back 153 years ago, there would have been about 21,000 troops that would have made it up through here. We're going to stop at 2 different places up here, and I'm going to show you a couple of really cool things that are related to the Battle of Jenkins Ferry. If you've read the book, Harvest of Death, the Battle of Jenkins Ferry, or if you followed the Facebook page, you know that there are 2 sites related to this. There is what's called the Cannonball House, and then the Jenkins House. And the first site we're going to stop at up here is the Cannonball House. After the battle was over and the Confederates had moved south a little ways, they began to kind of fan out, and they would take over farmhouses out here. And there was a very large 2-story house out here, which was occupied at the time of the battle, and it was pressed into service as a Confederate field hospital. There's a lot of stories related to this place. It actually stood until the 1970s when it burned. And we'll be up here in just a second. I'll tell you a little bit more about the house and what was here. Also, something that's really cool up here is there is a brand new Sesquicentennial Marker. And those of you who follow the site, you have not seen this marker yet. This is like brand new here. So we're going to take a stop right here. I'm going to get out of the truck for just a second. And we're going to get out and we're going to walk around for just a minute here. And I'm going to show you the brand new marker that's been placed out here. This is the owner of the place. This is actually kind of cool. They placed their gate around this place. They did place a cannon out here. It was called the Cannonball House, and the house actually set directly in front of you right there where those groves of trees were. That's where the Cannonball House stood. It was actually a 2-story house. As the Federals made their way up, a little bit of history of the house before we get into what it was used for as the field hospital. As the Federals worked their way up, the rear of the Federal Army was about a mile down the road this way, and the Confederates caught up with them. There was an engagement which was referred to as Guess's Creek. And let's go over here. Let's take a look at this marker first before we do anything else here. This talks about actually the skirmish And I hope you can read that on the live marker right there. But there was artillery set up in the roadway between the Union and Confederate forces. The type of ordnance they were firing had a range of about 1,700 yards. And so what was happening is occasionally the Federal shells were firing south, obviously. Some of the Confederate shells were overshooting, and they actually struck that two-story house that sat right out here. There were some holes blown in the side of it. Those holes actually remained until the house burned in the 1970s, thus the name the Cannonball House. And let's take a look at the other side of the marker here. This is cool because I didn't know this marker was out here until today when I found it a little bit earlier. And that's the second side. The Sesquicentennial markers are really cool in that they'll help commemorate and tell the story of this battle long after we're all gone. So, back to the field hospital. After the battle, the Confederate brought their wounded out to this two-story house here, and one of the physicians, a Dr. McFeeder, wrote in his diary, they were amputating in the house, and he wrote in his diary that it talked about the number of wounded were being treated. There was one of the surgeons that talked about as they amputated from the house right here, they threw the arms and legs out the window. When he arrived at the house here, the arms and legs were actually piled up higher than the windows that were made out here as well. And they, from what we understood, they were actually buried outside along the yard out here. So buried directly in front of you here are a number of Confederate, and there were also Union soldiers that were brought down here as well. So there were a number of Union and Confederate soldiers who are buried in unmarked graves directly in front of you here. In the early 1900s, there was a persistent rumor that a very young Herbert Hoover spent the night in this house. And I did a little bit of research through the Hoover Library in Ames, Iowa. He was actually an engineering student from Stanford University, and he did spend a summer in the early 1900s surveying in Arkansas, and he was down in this part of the country. And there was a young lady a few years ago that sent me an email. I believe her grandfather was the county surveyor in Grant County, and he recalled the story of Hoover staying out here. I did not include it in the book because there's not any, 100% authentication to the story itself, but it still makes for a cool story. The house stood until the 1970s when it burned. There's no remnants of it left out there. In the revised, the third edition that's coming up of Harvest of Death, there's actually a picture of the Cannonball House as it looked shortly after the war, which is a pretty cool picture. We're going to get back down in the vehicle here and get turned around. And we're going to go up to one more side here I want you to take a look at here. Hang on just one second here. Okay, bear with me just a second here. This is worth seeing, this other place is. Just bear with me just a minute here. I'm still experimenting with this Facebook Live stuff. So, some of this is a little bit hit and miss, but nonetheless, I think it gives you kind of a live view of history from a perspective. We've got a number of people on the Facebook page from Iowa and Wisconsin and Illinois where they're not able to come down here. And this way, you're able to see what the place looks like. Okay, this other side is just as cool as the field hospital down here. We're going north on County Line Road number 1. And again, this is the original military road. So if you had an ancestor that fought at Jenkins Ferry, they marched on this very road that you're seeing right here. And I think that is cool. I think that's very cool. This is almost history that just comes alive out here. Now, on the afternoon of April 29th, 1864, go back in time, the Federal Army had marched up here. General Frederick Steele, let's find this place here just a second. General Frederick Steele pulled off of the main road and stopped right here. there was a house that stood basically in that clearing right there, and that's referred to as the Giles House. So General Steele stopped where that house used to sit right there, and he conferred with his other generals in terms of basically their course of action once they get to the river. Steele, at the time he stopped here, did not know that the river was flooded. So there was no pontoon bridge yet. There was nothing like that. They just stopped to confer here. Now, what is so cool about this site is once the Federal Army moved on, once they got up to Jenkins Ferry and they started doing their crossing, and the Confederates were moving up the river, or up the road here, the Confederate commanding general, Kirby Smith, stopped at this very same house where he had a council of war with his generals. So this house was unique in that two commanding generals from two forces at Jenkins Ferry stopped here to confer and to counsel about the battle before they proceeded. This house, again, like the Cannonball House down the road, burned in the 1970s. It's very distressing. I'd like to see them place a marker right here as well. I don't know if that will ever happen or not. But again, this was a short little Facebook Live showing you a couple of sites related to the Battle of Jenkins Ferry.